Precarious work from the human rights perspective and the role of labor law in it. From the historical point of view, labor law has emerged in Europe somewhere in the middle and during the second half of the 19th century as a reaction to extremely inhumane conditions of work. As a reaction to extremely inhumane conditions of work and exploitation of workers. Today, we would say extremely precarious working and living conditions. I see similarities in this. I don't think this, what is happening now is extremely new situation. It can be compared to situations from the beginning of capitalism. And this was accompanied by the growing social unrest. Gradually, more and more legal rules setting minimum rights of workers limited the employers' absolute freedom in determining these conditions. It was never easy, this progress in recognizing workers' rights, making them legally binding and enforceable. It has been the result of demands and struggles of workers' movements, trade unions, actions and pressure, strikes, demands of left-wing political parties. Labor law can be seen as a means to, let's say, preserve social peace, as an instrument to resolve conflicts between capital and labor. It can be regarded as an instrument preventing the precariousness of working and consequently living conditions. It is a result of struggles for respecting human dignity of working people. That is, for the majority of people who earn their living by working for someone else. It is a set of rights giving a certain protection to workers because of their dependent, weaker position. What protection does it offer? Does this certain protection of workers' rights mean minimum, necessary protection, as low as possible, or as high as possible? We have here two alternatives. Is it something desirable, valuable, or is it something annoying, an obstacle? That depends, obviously, we all know, on the perspective from which we look at the labor law and social law more generally. Especially since the end of the 70s, 80s, we can witness constant pressure of the neoliberal ideology, trying to lower the level of labor law protection, to make labor markets more flexible, etc., etc. We have been witnessing many different methods of how to squeeze out as much labor law as possible from our societies. For example, these methods of disintegrating and dissolving labor law are as follows. We had at first, of course, the demands of lowering labor law protection as a general level of workers' rights. Let's say is an explicit dissolving, minimizing labor law protection. General legislative reforms, concluding new, less favorable collective agreements, and so on. But besides such explicit, direct, and general formal lowering of labor law protection, there has been, and still is, an indirect, silent, de facto dissolution of labor law rights going on. For example, by non-observance of formally binding workers' rights in practice. Many workers do not claim their rights before courts. Labor inspection is not effective as well. That is a kind of silent lowering, sometimes even abolishing of certain workers' rights. It is the actual enforced level of workers' labor law protection, workers' rights protection, which is important, not just declarative level. In addition, another neoliberal trend has been going on, especially since the 80s. The expansion of so-called flexible forms of employment, atypical employment, which is connected with this notion of precarious work. if it was not possible, or if it was more difficult to lower general level of labor law protection for all workers, it was easier to promote by claiming that they raise employment, but they not. It was easier to promote the introduction of more and more fixed-term part-time work, agency work, and other non-standard forms of employment contracts by claiming that they raise employment. They are linked with de jure and de facto less employment protection and fewer rights, worse, more precarious employment and living conditions. Another way of gradual, indirect, silent, not easy to see dissolution of labor law is the trend of so-called stepping out of labor law, the externalization, contractualization of labor law. A growing number of people work outside labor law protection as self-employed, so-called self-employed, and different civil law contracts. I like the expression Maivresnik used, second-hand workers. If the definition of employment relationship or its interpretation in practice is too narrow, labor law does not apply in situations where people are in need of such protection. All that leads to precarization of labor, more inequalities, more dependency and insecurity of people, and results in a high risk not to be able to live and work according to human dignity standards. This trend of promotion and expansion of different non-standard employment contracts, which are in a way becoming standard, especially for the young, as well as self-employment and other legal forms of performing work outside the scope of labor law, with less or even no labor law protection at all, presents a strong indirect pressure for the so-called regular workers and the general level of their rights. In 80s, let's say, neoliberal approach, IMF, World Bank and so on, they promoted more and more flexible, so-called flexible forms of employment by claiming that you raise employment. That didn't happen. But what happened is this segmentation, and now this segmentation is the argument of the same ILO and so on, neoliberal approach, that is the argument showing that it is necessary to equalize the level of protection. In their language, that means lowering the protection of regular workers. But this can be done also other way round, by raising the protection of precarious work. And if even they say that precarious work is a problem, why then putting also all the rest of them in this similar situation? It's really not a very smart idea. Well, but that is happening now. And with these different kind of forms in which people work, there's also the problem of apparent conflict of interests between different groups of working people being in different employment or contractual status. Instead of acting as a more or less homogeneous group and consequently a strong social counterpower against the interests of the employers, the capital, the working people are dispersed, divided into different groups by employment status with different, apparently conflicting interests. And they lose their power. We heard about the difficulty how to organize precarious workers. Consequently, there are problems with the representation of their interests within trade unions and within the collective bargaining process as well. On one hand, flexible workers and contractors outside employment relations are not well organized, and their interests are not always well represented in the trade union actions and collective bargaining process. On the other hand, if representing predominantly regular workers and their interests, trade unions can lose members, legitimacy, relevance, and their social power. Another pressure that labor law is faced with is the growing and persistent unemployment, which seems to be a necessary part and consequence of the existing system, acting also as a pressure to those having employment. It is difficult to preserve the level of labor law protection and to advocate for more workers' rights if there is a constant pressure of numbers of unemployed people. Besides, activation policies and social welfare reforms, reducing social benefits and so on, consequently can make this pressure even stronger. Under this pressure, people are willing to work under worse working conditions for lower pay, with less or even without any labor law protection, just to get a job and some income for living. It does not matter whether with decent working conditions or not. The question, I think, in my view, the question should be reopened as to the meaning of the right to work and of the concept of full employment. And finally, taking into account the above trends, what should the relationship between labor law and social security system be? What should be the responsibility of individual worker and the collectively agreed, guaranteed rights through the social security? Especially, this question is especially relevant when so many people are outside labor law protection, either because they do not work under the contract of employment or because they do not work at all. So, is it really the work and being the worker that constitutes the basis for acquiring human dignity? Or should we, in my way, I agree with these ideas, we should broaden the basis to the so-called social citizenship and recognize the right to a universal basic income. Well, I strongly agree with Professor Isson, who emphasized that it is not enough just to introduce universal basic income, and it is more the question of what is the height, the level of it, and so on. But in my view, this is not a question or either. It is a question of combining, let's say, basic income, but at the same time, it is necessary to develop, to have well-developed labor law, giving high level of workers' rights based on the principle of full employment. That obviously opens the question of reducing working time and similar. These go hand in hand, in my view. Well, the answer to all this, what I've been speaking about, depends on the perspective from which we look at the labor and social law, which are fundamental pillars of social state principle. Well, according to the neoliberal model promoted by IMF, World Bank, and so on, as well as the EU policy and the Troika strategy, this neoliberal model is supported with all these different indexes and ratings, doing business index, employment protection, legislation index, and so on. Well, according to this model, obviously labor costs, labor and social law is seen as an obstacle to high competitiveness and economic growth. A country's score is worse if its labor law guarantees more rights and more protection to the workers. In this case, labor law is labeled as rigid. Whereas its score is better if there is less protection for the workers, even if the minimum ILO and other international labor standards are not respected. Countries are pushed into the irrational competition in social dumping. They are becoming commodities. Countries are not sovereign states anymore. There is a problem with democracy and all that. Yes, countries are becoming commodities governed by the markets, by the different agencies and ratings. Law shopping is going on. There is something very wrong with these indexes and ratings, especially in two ways: how and especially what they measure. Within this neoliberal model, labor is treated as if it was a commodity. I emphasize, not as a commodity, it is not a commodity. as if it was a commodity. But that does not turn labor into a commodity. If someone is treated as a slave, denied to be a human being, does it mean that she or he is really not a human being? No. If a person is treated as something they are not, this does not turn them into that. It just means that we have the problem of the wrong perception, of the wrong presentation, that a mistake has been done. We can question ourselves consciously or unconsciously, voluntarily or involuntarily, because of lack of knowledge and competence to understand, or because of greed and lack of humanity. Well, it has to be emphasized that the human rights perspective is the prescribed, obligatory perspective, not just one of possible options. You don't have equally presented options, let's say neoliberal human rights and so on. Human rights perspective is obligatory perspective, stemming from the legally binding international treaties on human rights and state constitutions. They form the legal foundations of our societies. From the human rights perspective, workers, people are human beings with human rights, and these rights aim to respect and realize human dignity. Well, just in short, it is very difficult to make a short exposition on human rights, but in short, the essence of human dignity is equality. There is no human dignity if people are not treated equally. And there could be no human rights society if fundamental social rights are not respected as human rights as well. They are not fundamental social rights. They are not just appendix, let's say, collateral benefit of economic growth. They are not conditional. They should not be conditional if society can afford them. They are essential for the development of every human society. They actually reflect fundamental social rights, labor law, social security, etc. They actually reflect and derive from the substantive material approach to equality and human rights. They are necessary for the concretization of the principle of equality in its material, substantive meaning. And equality is in the heart of human rights. It is the essence of human dignity. More equality means better life for everybody. And I agree with Standing Kresal that we should speak more about these fundamental questions. So, therefore, we should all have the opportunity to work and live in the conditions which respect human dignity. From the human rights perspective, labor law is not rigid if it gives high level of workers' protection. It is well developed. Well, after a century of intensive development of human rights, especially after World War II, it is necessary to approach to labor as well as social law and to evaluate its aims and goals, its effects and functions from the human rights perspective. And it is necessary that legally binding documents on human rights are taken seriously. It is our duty to emphasize and repeat this obvious fact, which is too often overseen in practice and in politics nowadays. Therefore, according to the human rights perspective, labor law has to promote quality jobs, non-discriminatory practices of employers, prevent precariousness of labor and working poverty. It has to guarantee decent work for all. The goal should be as high quality of living and working conditions as possible. In order to be able to fulfill its functions and aims, labor law has to develop further also, and especially at the international level. It is not possible to develop labor law only within one country, only at the national level, or only within the European Union, although it's not very good to develop nowadays. Within the globalized world, such an approach supports the neoliberal concept and pushes countries into this irrational competition in social dumping. neoliberal model is economically unsuccessful, from one crisis to another, socially ineffective, it has not erased poverty, it has raised it, unemployment, and so on, and environmentally non-sustainable. It is obviously, I will not elaborate further on this. But I would like to emphasize that especially neoliberal model is not consistent with the human rights perspective. And if this system, capitalism, is not able to respect human rights, then there's something very wrong with the system, not with these rights. And human rights, well, of course there is a problem. There is a strong declaration. They are, at the declarative level, they are recognized. But in nowadays practice, we see constantly human rights being breached. But it is an important achievement of previous struggles for more social justice and so on, that these rights, human rights, and within it, fundamental social rights, have been recognized as legally binding and as a legal foundation of our society. Well, obviously, this is not enough, but it is an important aspect which should be emphasized all the time. Besides, we need social counterpower, which would limit the power of neoliberalism. And I think it is here. It has always been here, and it will be. We just have to nourish it and develop it further, empower it, every day in many different ways, from bottom-up alternative solutions that we have been listening to in the morning session, and also at the, let's say, theoretical, systematic level as well. To conclude, I think, yes, subversive knowledge is crucial, as well as community spirit. So, thank you.